So, okay, great. So hello everybody, I'm Giulia. I'm Junior Editor at WIWIP, Women in War International Politics. Within King's College of London, we seek to showcase the important contribution made to research and teaching made by women. WIWIP aims not only to address the challenges faced by women working in the field of war studies, security and defense, international politics, but also to focus and draw attention to the excellent work done by women in this field. Indeed, it is an honor today to have Hannah Neumann as our guest. Hannah is a member of European Parliament, where she works for the promotion of the fundamental principle of peace, security, and human rights for the entire European community and the world in general. In particular, Hannah is Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Human Rights, member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, and Subcommittee on Security and Defense Policy. She has been traveling a lot to many crisis regions to foster peace in places destroyed by conflict, such as Iraq and northeast Syria. Hannah is here today to talk about an incredible initiative launched last year in 2020 for the 20th anniversary of the United Nations Security Council resolution on women, peace and security. Indeed, she is co-author of the SHEcurity Index, which tracks the improvement in the women, peace and security agenda implementation since the UN resolution 1325. So dear Hannah, would you like to discuss the reason why you and your team members were inspired to create the SHEcurity Index?
Sure, Giulia, and first of all, thank you so much for having me with you. And I think it's exactly these kinds of links between research, politics, work in the field that we need in general, but especially where women need, I think, to advance the cause that we all fight for so hardly. I was a researcher myself. I have a PhD actually in peace and conflict studies. So I usually, when I do political work, so somehow that's still in me. So I want to have a proper analysis of the situation. I want to have proper data so I kind of can better understand where the problem is and how we can move forward for the political aim. So when I took over the report in the European Parliament called Gender Equality in EU's Foreign and Security Policy, my first idea was, okay, we all have these feeling that there are far less women than men when it comes to the political decision making, but also when it comes to diplomacy, especially heading missions and delegations, when it comes to the military, when it comes to the EU's missions, like the civilian and the military missions. And I kind of also had the just impression that we are not moving very much or very fastly ahead. We have these goals since 20 years, since Resolution 1325, but I just didn't have the impression that we are being super fast in implementing these things. So I said, okay, well then to my team, let's look at the data. And then we were surprised that there is basically no data. So when it comes to NATO nations, you can go through all the NATO annual reports and you would, I think, be able to have data from going back until 2007. That's where we started. So we just went through all the national, like all the annual reports and tried to get the data from there. And then we look at national parliaments and trying to see how the percentages compared in the parliaments to what we have in the foreign and security committees, for example. And then we tried to look at diplomacy and we didn't have any data. Like how many women do we have in the diplomatic corps? How many women do we have leading delegations? The European External Action Service has it since a very few years. And that was the moment where I said, okay, I mean, first of all, how can it be we don't have that data if everybody says the issue is so important? And then if we already start to do all this legwork to gather the data, why don't we make it public afterwards? And that's kind of how the idea of the SHEcurity Index was born. So we try to get as much publicly available data as possible, but we also reached out to all the embassies and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the EU and G20 countries to get data from them. And the result you see in the SHEcurity Index, the way it is now, we have gathered a lot of data. Also very informative data, but we also have still quite a number of gaps that we will be trying to close throughout this year. And then hopefully when we relaunch it in October 2021, hopefully there will be more and better data. But I want also to make one point very clear. In the SHEcurity Index, we're only talking about the representation of women by numbers. But something like a feminist foreign policy or even a gender equal policy is much more. But the other aspects are somehow harder to count. and more difficult to kind of put them into simple tables. So that's something we are also working on, and I always want to make very clear that's also important. But SHEcurity is about the representation.
Thank you so much for your response. So how can the SHEcurity Index improve the underrepresentation of women in the field of peace and security? Do you think it has raised awareness among state parties of the EU?
Well, Julia, I think that's actually the first thing it did, because everybody has this wobbly feeling it's not enough, but really putting it into numbers, you get quite a big percentage of people say, okay, that's really not what we aim for. So something like in some of the military forces, it would take 500 years until we have equality. But even in diplomatic services, you have a difference between Sweden, where we have 50% of the missions or the delegations actually had the embassies headed by women, whereas in Belgium, we have something like 10%. And I don't think Belgium likes to see these charts. And was the first thing. Just we have now real numbers that no one can say, well, it's not that bad, or no one really knows, but we have these numbers, it's hard facts, and people need to find their way to deal with these numbers. And we put the issue again high on the priority list, because that's most often for me the problem with this whole gender and representation thing. Everybody somehow thinks it's important, but then it always falls down on the priority list. And so once a year now, we are really moving it up to the top. We already saw now on March 8th that others were picking up our numbers to make posts on the International Women's Day with our numbers. And we now do our second round of outreach. So we are now again writing to all the embassies and delegations and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of all the countries, saying, do you have new numbers of 2020? Can you fill some of these gaps in the data? And their responses are much quicker and much nicer than last time, that I can tell you. So apparently it has already changed a bit.
That's incredible, really incredible initiative. So based on your personal experience as a woman and as a politician, in which way do patriarchal attitudes still obstacle the involvement of women in fields like peace and security? Will this ever be totally eradicated from the institutional realm?
Well, that's a number of questions
I know.
in one. But let me first speak about the question, how do these patriarchal structures leave women out? And I want to reply to that from a very personal and then a more systematic note. I mean, just for me, I never studied. I mean, in the first place, I did media studies, because that's kind of the stuff that women study. Like when did I start studying? I have to say that it was 18 years ago. You didn't see women in foreign policy. You didn't see women in the military. So how could I, as a kid that just grew up in a normal village, I was the first woman ever going to university, see myself there? I didn't have a role model. And then just by the work I did and by doing an exchange to the Philippines and then being stuck with this fascination of moving from conflict to peace, I just found this a very fascinating topic, and I just pursued it out of interest. But then I realized often I'm like the only one in the room, the only woman in the room. And then it's always this mix of either being curiously stared at or just being ignored that I had to face. And this feeling within me that I would actually need 10 minutes to explain why I have a right to speak before I can actually make my point, especially as a young woman, which often silenced me. So then I just didn't do the point, because I thought, well, I mean, is it worth the bother? Do I feel comfortable enough? Well, no, I didn't. So it's this mix of two, the lack of role models, of just women who pick the fight and say, well, guys, you need, with all this uncertainty, it makes for you to have these strong women speaking up, and all this not being like reassured in whatever stereotypes you have of this world. I mean, just face it, that's where I'm now. I'm just like, well, that's your problem. If I don't fit into your box your box may be the problem. So just fix that problem for you, it's not mine. But I didn't have that even 5 years ago. So not having these role models and having this system in which you kind of always realize whenever you enter into your room, you don't belong here, is something that doesn't make things easier. And that's something I can change, and many other women who are in the field now can change. And we can have each other's back. And we really do that by now. There is quite a bunch of young women, and we are having actually fun to just showing that we can stand up and you will have to deal with it. The second one is more the systemic issue, but it comes a bit with it. Far too often until now, and that goes beyond representation, we still see that in the very tricky moments, is there in times of crisis. We had that with the corona pandemic. Look at Emmanuel Macron's cabinet de guerre. I mean, already the name is a bit strange, but was just men. In the initial pandemic phase, again, we only had the men because basically it was, I call all my buddies, I know best, and we solve the crisis, and then we can talk about the women issues. So that's kind of that we had with the pandemic, but we also far too often have it when it comes to questions of war and peace, where basically those holding the arms and being in control of certain areas of land are the ones who are invited to peace negotiations, and not the people who for many centuries or decades actually try to promote peaceful solutions. Well, and often just empirically, it's men with the guns, and it's more of the women for this other part. And as long as we don't manage to, of course, we need to have the people with the guns at the negotiation table, but does that have to be the whole negotiation table? Or can we just now have another half with the other kind of people? As long as we don't challenge this logic, also, it will be a long time. Still, I have hope, because you said, how long is it going to take, and will it always be that way? Well, wouldn't I have hoped to change that? I wouldn't do that job with all that passion. But on a more serious note, I think we have a growing frustration at the moment in foreign policy, because everybody, also the men, realizing we are running against the same walls again and again and again. So I think there's some openness to just see what are options of things that we can do differently that may change something. And I think that is one of the reasons why this whole idea of a feminist foreign policy that focuses more on discrimination and eliminating discrimination rather than stabilizing governments and countries is one that gains track. I wouldn't say that this is the solution to everything, but I think following this one is a good way to solve some of the problems that we face over and over again.
Definitely. Thank you so much for this response. So we have our last question. So based on your personal experience, could you give us some examples of how the involvement of women in peace negotiation actually made peace last longer?
Well, I mean, first of all, there are just numbers basically saying the more gender equal a society, the more peaceful it is, and the more women are at the negotiation table, the longer the peace deals last. There's also kind of anecdotal evidence. If you just bring into your mind all the bad guys around the world, I don't know how many women and how many men you have in your head, but usually it's quite a big proportion of men and quite a small proportion of women, if you ever even manage to have one in your head. But for me, the main point is, I'm not even saying that all women are peaceful. I don't even think we can have it 100% assured that if we have 100% women, the outcome would be better. For me, the key point is, if you're talking about foreign policy, about societies, about change, about war and peace, these are very complex issues. And we really need to make every attempt possible to have the diversity of people who have to deal with whatever comes out of these processes at the table where this is being discussed. Because everybody from their own experiences, from their own points of view, have a different lens, a different assessment of the situation. And if we bring these together the best way possible, then the solutions are the more sustainable possible. And I cannot give you 2 or 3 examples. And I mean, they always cover just a very, very small, slim slide of what I just described, but they may still help, I think, people to grasp the concept. The first one may be when I worked in Liberia after the Civil War. The UN, when they started their peacekeeping mission in Liberia, what they usually do is they do a security assessment, and then they do a security strategy. And basically, in case of an escalation or when tensions grow, there are certain prime spots, that they would make sure that they have the biggest security, or that they would watch especially. And well, as things are, most often it's men who do these kind of security assessments. And the security assessment in Liberia, and actually it's pretty representative for many others, was we have our prime security spots on the big streets going to the capital, like the high roads. I mean, high road is not a high road in Liberia, it's mud road, but kind of the main roads, and the petrol stations. That is a very state-centered focus on security, because basically it means we need to secure the capital. Mm-hmm. Whereas most of the security incidents actually happen with women fetching water. Yeah. So that's where the security incidents happen. And if you have this very male perspective on security, you go with the highways. And if you have the female one, well, you may more go with communal security structures. Another one, when Mission Sophia was set up, so the mission of the European Union that was doing search and rescue in the Mediterranean, the first one that was just there to do search and rescue, that is usually not a military task, but they need to do it with military means, because that were kind of the only ships and command structures they had in place. So they had a long discussion about the operation plans, and about what kind of training, what kind of equipment would be needed. And most of the discussion was around how do we train the soldiers to deal with potentially armed people on the boats, so like the so-called smugglers or human traffickers. And what kind of weapons would they need, what kind of trainings would they need, what kind of legal context would that have? And at one point, the woman said, yeah, okay, but what's with sanitary napkins and diapers? Because we are going to take women and small children on board, and they're going to stay with us for a few days. And that was quite a big struggle for the whole organization. How do you have that proper supply of these things? Never had been there. And that's just because as a woman, and I assume she has had children, she had this different, put yourself in the situation and think what the problem is like. And I'm not saying you don't need to think about how to deal with the armed people. I'm just saying you need both. And just one last example, moving a bit away from the military, because that was actually also an eye-opener for me working on these gender issues. For example, we assume, and there's a lot of truth in that if we invest a lot of money in education, that's good. So, for example, if we invest more in education than we do in big roads and petrol stations. But if we invest a lot of money in education in a society where girls and women don't have access to education, or very limited access to education, we are actually increasing the gender gap. So that's why I'm saying we also really need to look into the unintended consequences of very well-intentioned policies if we want to ensure that we really work towards more gender equality. And that is a very complex things that need to be high on the priority list, that should be done by experts, and that I think require the diversity at all the tables, but that they also require, I think, everyone getting a better understanding of these gender dimensions of our conflict response.
Thank you so much for your response and for the examples you brought. And thank you for joining us today. It has been a really incredible conversation to talk about the SHEcurity Index. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Giulia, for having me. And I hope you guys all make good use of all this data, because that's what it's there for.
Sure. Thank you so much. Have a great day.